everyone. Welcome to your newest episode of the Cosmic Matrix podcast with your host, myself, Laura Matsu, and Bernhard Gunther. And in this episode, we are going to be talking about how to find your role in rebirthing the new world and how this relates to generations that are live here today. We're going to correlate it with the fourth turning, which is a concept by Neil Howe and William Strauss. Some of you may have heard of it. How this is also related to the Pluto generations that are alive today. How the Pluto generations evolve consciousness and what the bottom line is for these generations who are alive today. How we can evolve consciousness during these times, potential challenges, and really how to prepare ourselves both physically, emotionally, and spiritually for the times ahead. So basically, we are in the fourth turning right now. We're in the crisis period. This started, according to Neil Howe and William Strauss, at 2008. With the financial crisis that happened back then, is going to be going till 2028. So we're really in critical times right now. And I think it is really important that we understand that we each have a very unique role to play in evolving consciousness during these times. And rather than get worried and focused on the fear and the crisis and the doom and gloom, really understanding the deeper patterns at play here, I think will really help people ground themselves during these times. So before we get into all of that, I want to make a quick announcement about the next Embodied Soul Awakening program that we have, which is our 12-week online group coaching program in psychological and spiritual self-work with Bernhard Gunther and myself, Laura Matsu. So the next enrollment or the next round is going to start July 25th until October 15th. And if you want to apply for that, just go to www.thetimeoftransition.com. Again, that's thetimeoftransition.com. And just learn, you can learn more about the course and apply there. And I just want to make a note because we've had a few emails lately about people asking us about in-person retreats. So for those who don't know, Bernhard and I actually first started out doing in-person retreats in the jungle in Peru, and then all the kind of craziness happened and we switched it all online. So the answer is yes, we are being open and kind of in the beginning stages of seeding the ideas of having in-person retreats, most likely in the upcoming year. But we are going to change the game a little bit, and we aren't going to be working with people in person retreats anymore unless they go through our program, our Embodied Soul Awakening program, mainly because we want to go really deep in the in-person retreats. And this is all a prerequisite actually for going deeper. So if you're waiting for our in-person retreats to open up again, you haven't taken our course yet, I highly recommend you jump on this next round. That's going to be the next opportunity. And then we'll give the announcement probably a couple months in the future whenever we have things more planned and solidified. But we're actually just going to be reaching out to the people who we've already worked with and giving them the opportunity first. So the bottom line is, if you want to work with us in person, yes, we are open to doing in-person retreats here in Sedona where we live. However, the prerequisite is going to be that you have to have done the online program with us or worked with us in some way in order to come, just so that you have the basis, because we really want to go deeper in the in-person retreats. We have a lot of special things in mind planned in the woodwork right now. But we found that the in-person retreats are way more effective if there's already a solid basis in shadow work of understanding your early childhood, your basic kind of psychological issues. So we really want to make sure that people have that foundation. So again, if you want to work with us, our next round for Embodied Soul Awakening is July 25th to October 15th. And you can get the link on Bernhard's website at veilofreality.com or just go directly to the course page, which is thetimeoftransition.com. And with that being said, let's go into the topic of this podcast. So find your role in rebirthing the new world.
All right. So... Well, a lot of things are happening, always happening. It's pretty intense, I mean, I've written about this over the past few years. We haven't seen nothing yet. I keep saying over and over, and that's what we're seeing right now. It is very intensifying. It is very obvious. We cannot deny the immense changes, also on the basic physical material level. I mean, we cannot deny the inflation anymore. Not only, by the way, in the US, but also in Europe. All the world is affected globally. This is not just in the US. The US is going through its Pluto return. That's reflected in that as well. And Laura can talk more about that too. But it's happening globally. We're going through a big shift. It's called the time of transition for a reason. And again, there's a lot of opportunity within the shift, but there's devolution, there is involution, there's disillusionment, the descent in order to ascend. Everything that is in alignment needs to be weeded out. And it's obviously, we also see the archetypal battle of quote unquote dark versus light on multidimensional levels. This is occurring in the wars through us, right? But we cannot deny the financial crisis, economic crisis, market crashes, crypto is down and under. A lot of crypto people, everybody's freaking out. But we need to be careful. It's very easy to get in this doom and gloom, fear, negativity, fear frequency. And the irony of this whole economy, basically how it works, even markets, it's pure psychology in a sense, right? People panic selling and all of that. It's all psychologically based. So especially, people who are highly focused only on a materialistic level, on a physical level, right? If they just focus on that, have no spiritual or psychological foundation, they will have the hardest time because a lot of that stuff is disintegrating and they are certainly attached to their materialistic way of view of life, so to speak. So, that needs to be updated. The materialistic way of living doesn't work in the new world anymore. And this doesn't mean to deny the material world or anything like that. We need to expand our vision, our consciousness, and really understand higher laws and universal laws and how everything, works for our higher good. Ironically, there's always opportunity in all of that. But most of all, what I've seen also in myself, right, and many others, we need to be mindful, not get into this negative mindset. And by that, I don't mean just forcing yourself to be positive or take the new age pill and deny the dark. No, we need to face reality, but also observe yourself how easily this negativity can get to you, and the fear frequency and the fear thoughts, and that's how the matrix gets us as well. And hence the self-care aspect is so important. Yeah, there may need to be some physical preparation on a just basic common sense level, but most importantly is really the spiritual and psychological foundation preparation, the inner work to really be the change we want to see. Because again, also there's an aspect to reality creation. Don't forget, as within, so without. And I don't imply the oversimplified new age way of reality creation of just focusing on positive thoughts and your desires, but no, having a healthy, optimistic vision. There's something to be said about healthy optimism. And sometimes, yes, we do get dragged down, into fear, worry. Recently I've also, felt a lot of sadness within myself and the world, like what people are going through. So we need to allow ourselves and give room to feel these feelings as well, not to avoid them or freak out about them. Just allow yourselves to feel them. That actually transmutes them. And that's most often easier said than done, because for many of us, a lot of other stuff comes up, childhood stuff, unconscious trauma, or shadow gets activated. All of that is coming to the surface. So we really need the tools and the awareness and the knowledge how to do this work, how to have this deeper foundation and this spiritual aspiration as well.
Yeah, and that spiritual foundation is really going to be a major key as we switch into Pluto in Aquarius, which we're going to get into in the second hour. But basically, Pluto and the jump from Pluto and Capricorn to Pluto and Aquarius is a jump from the material to the transpersonal domains of reality. And I'm not saying that everyone's just going to become like awakened during that period. Highly unlikely, because we all have different levels of consciousness. But that's kind of the edge that we're working with. So the spiritual foundation is really key on the larger on a larger sense. So let's go into the fourth turning, because this is a very in-depth topic and we're going to kind of talk about it as we go along. So let me just define it. And this is actually from John Maudlin, his description of it. And he says, basically in 1997, Neil Howe and William Strauss introduced the concept of the fourth turning. And they divided the population into 4 generational archetypes: the hero, the artist, the prophet, and the nomad. Each generation consists of people who were born and came of age at the same period in history. They had similar experiences and gravitated towards similar attitudes. So they're archetypes, basically. And the change of control from one generation to the next, meaning as each generation comes into age, like in their prime age, in their 30s and 40s, they basically represent a turning in this scheme of that Strauss and Howe have outlined. And the fourth turning, the cycle repeats, sparking a generational crisis. And so each turning lasts about 20 to 25 years. And basically, when he uses this word, he doesn't mean a short period of difficulty. He means an existential crisis. So usually this is one in which society's strongest institutions collapse or are severely challenged and stressed, and national survival is in serious doubt. So we're in that period right now. And by his timeline, we're basically in the fourth turning, and that started in 2008. And the fourth turning, if it's like previous ones, has certain themes that we're going to go into. So let me just kind of talk about it real quick about the most recent turnings. So the crisis period, the last fourth turning was basically the Great Depression and World War II. And that was in 1925 to 1945. The high after that, the first turning, was the post-war boom from 1946 to 1960. The awakening, the second turning, was the consciousness revolution. So the hippie revolution from 1961 to 1981. The unraveling was the third turning, which was the Reagan revolution, which was 1982 to 2006. And then the crisis fourth turning is in 2008 to 2028. So originally, I think he thought that was a little bit earlier, but then recently Neil Strauss went on an interview and he said that the fourth turning, he believes the fourth turning started in 2008 and will go into 2028.
Which, by the way, it's interesting to know 2028 also pretty close to 2030, which is kind of the timeline for the WEF, the World Economic Forum, the Great Reset Agenda 2030.
Yeah, exactly. So let me talk about the first turning and what that kind of represented. And this is actually from the blog, The Art of Manliness, by Brett McKay. And he says, hi, the first turning. So then these are just the themes of each turning so that you can kind of understand the larger cycles. And then I'm going to link it to the Pluto generations, and that will be more personally related to your generation and what you may have to do on a soul level in order to evolve consciousness during these times. So the first turning follows the crisis era. So that's something to look forward to just know that after this crisis, after 2028, it's going to be followed by a high. After the Dark Ages comes a period of enlightenment, the descend and then ascend. And so basically, this is a time with strong civic values. Institutions are strong and individualism is weak. Ideas that were valued during a crisis are institutionalized. The emphasis during a high is on planning and building, doing big things. Society is confident about where it wants to go collectively, though those outside the majority often feel stifled by conformity. Culture is friendly but bland and lacks spiritual depth. Big technological advances are often made during high eras. The amount of structure, protection, nurturing given to children begins to diminish towards the end of the turning. During a high, old prophets die off, nomads enter elderhood, heroes enter midlife, artists enter young adulthood, and a new generation of prophets is born. So this is a post-war boom, basically.
That was between 1948 and 1963. The first turning. So just to be clarify, so we are right now in the fourth turning. Mm-hmm. So I'm just asking you, because if you look more into that than me, so this fourth turning, so it goes in cycles of four. Like after the fourth turning, we go
back to the first turning,
exactly. But on a different level of consciousness.
Exactly,
obviously, it's not like we're going to re-experience the period.
No. Right. And I actually would argue that once you add the Pluto generations into this, it will add the necessary nuance into it. So anyway, let me just go quickly through the other turnings, and then I'm going to talk about the fourth turning. So the awakening is the second turning, and the focus of society shifts from building institutions to developing an individual's inner life. So new social ideas emerge during this time, and experimentation with utopian communities is common. Members of the coming of age prophet generations are often at the forefront of the spiritual awakening during second turning eras. Young activists look back at the previous high as a period of cultural and spiritual poverty, and begin to rebel against the midlife hero generation who made it possible. So this is the consciousness revolution of the 1960s. So this is all the hippie generation, basically. And then he also likens it to the great awakenings of the 18th and 19th century were also examples of awakening turnings. Okay, and then we get into the unraveling.
The third turning.
The third turning, yes. So the unraveling begins as society embraces the liberating cultural forces set loose by the awakening, basically. So all the kind of stuff that the hippies did starts to get really embedded into the culture. Individualism and personal satisfaction are at their highest, while community and trust in public institutions are at their lowest. Pleasure-seeking and extreme lifestyles emerge. Society fragments into polarizing groups, which become increasingly entrenched in their respective ideologies, making the reaching of consensus and the taking of decisive public action difficult. Instead of addressing problems, businesses and governments just kick the can down the road, so just avoid it. Confidence in society's future darkens and the culture feels used up and worn out. Civic and moral paralysis and apathy sets in. Art reflects the growing pessimism as themes of dreary realism take center stage. So he basically says that the most recent unraveling began at the second term of the Reagan administration and continued into the 2000s. So this is like the 80s and 90s, basically.
You know what's kind of, just interject real quick?
Yes.
So this is what you just mentioned with the unraveling. And as I see from this first, second, and third turning, and the unraveling third turning, when, as you said, that begins as society embraces the liberating cultural forces set loose by the awakening.
Yes.
So it's very similar to the evolutionary astrology concept, or the other esoteric traditions of the evolution of consciousness, going from the consensus state into individuated state. And then the individuated state becomes the new individuated state becomes the consensus state.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And then out of that new consensus state, the new individuated state is built upon, and so on and so forth.
Totally, yeah,
right?
exactly. Because like evolutionary astrology, which we'll get into in a second, follows natural law. And I personally think, looking at this, basically natural law is observable in nature. You can prove it actually through understanding the laws that govern nature. So what I'm thinking is a part of him was also just kind of tuning into natural law through observing the themes of history, basically. Okay. So, and you can see this, when he started this kind of like the pessimism, think about the grunge movement, all like the kind of metal music and like, the music, the apathy. Yeah, exactly. Like Kurt Cobain came out during this period, yes. And he was such a figure of this kind of third turning. Anyway, okay. So the crisis, fourth turning. So we're in the fourth turning now. And according to the guy who wrote this book, Neil Strauss, he says that it started in 2008. So, and it goes until 2028. And he says, this is from the Art of Manliness blog still. And he describes that as an era when America's institutional life is destroyed and rebuilt into response to a perceived threat to the nation's survival. This threat can take several forms: economic distress caused by defaulting on national debt, hyperinflation or widespread unemployment, social distress caused by class or race warfare, ecological distress caused by natural or man-made disasters, energy or water shortages, epidemics/pandemics, secessions and civil revolts, and traditional nuclear or cyber warfare are some of the possibilities.
So he wrote this a long time ago.
Yes, 1997, yes.
1987, wasn't it?
I believe in 1997, no.
Oh, 1997,
yeah,
you're
1997,
right.
yeah.
Sorry,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, so going back to it. The crisis can be caused by one large threat or by many little things that society failed to deal with during the unraveling finally coming to a head. Mm-hmm. Obviously, societies are forced with wars and crises all the time. It is how society responds to the crisis that determines whether it catalyzes into a fourth turning. There are always sparks, but not all sparks turn into fire. A spark ignites a fourth turning because in some way the society is ready for it and wants it, though not consciously. They sense that society feels tired, worn out, and needs to be renewed. No matter what form the crisis takes, it galvanizes people into an action-taking consensus. Problems that were once kicked down the road during the unraveling are finally taken by the horns. Civic authority revives. Cultural expression redirects towards community purpose. Community is a huge aspect of the fourth turning. And people begin to locate themselves as members of a larger group. Self-sacrifice, institution building, and consensus replace self-interest, personal development, and contrarianism as values society encourages. Wanting to protect their children from the turmoil surrounding them, parents become overprotective during a crisis.
Yeah.
So America experienced a crisis era during the Revolutionary and Civil Wars. Our previous crisis began with the Great Depression and ended after World War II. And what they wrote in the fourth turning in 1997, they predicted the next turning would begin in the middle of the 2000s and last until 2025. So he changed that and he said actually 2028 it began. So just the message is, let me just say one more. Yeah, I know it's so dead on. It's crazy. And just two more points on that. The overall message is to make sure you're ready, just make sure you're ready. Realize the situation that we're in. And then John Maudlin, so I'm kind of taking from a couple blogs here, also said a really great quote, that America's moves into a fourth turning, there will be a time of great national trial and upheaval. Yet seeing this on the horizon does not prophesize a horrible tragedy. The fourth turning could also be a time of triumph. Just as the risk of war is great and the fourth turning, so too is the possibility of accomplishing things that in other eras would be impossible, especially in the areas of government, institutions, and infrastructure. It's important to remember that fourth turnings have occurred many times before in American history. Each has been an era where America felt good about itself as a society and a nation, a time when big problems have been solved, when businesses ultimately emerged prosperous, and when people came together with a new ethic of community and consensus. So to understand there's light at the end of this tunnel, that we have to go through this. It's also kind of like, just understanding natural law will help you understand the evolution of consciousness, which I'm going to touch into when I talk about Pluto. But just understanding that nature dissolves and decays and goes back into the ground in order to emerge as a new form. Think about the caterpillar to the butterfly. We're in this collective metamorphosis, and it's only through our fear of death, of decay, of dissolution, and thinking that it's the end that we are afraid of change. So we actually have to understand that in order for something new to emerge, what already exists will need to dissolve, decay, be destroyed, and that we are in this critical period. And then another thing to understand too, which he doesn't really touch on because I don't know how much he gets into the spiritual perspective, is that we are evolving consciousness right now too. And we are not, I think it was Einstein that said this quote, we are not going to solve this problem with the same level of consciousness that created it. So really think about that and think about your own consciousness and where are you coming from, because you can see there's so much darkness, doom and gloom, fear. People are also mass traumatized right now. They're getting disassociated, out of body. The stress of the last couple of years is leading to burnout. So many things, so it is really important that we're going to have to come together. And also there's a big grief process that's going to have to happen, I think, especially for us who are more spiritually sensitive, especially for the people who have lost people over the past couple of years. So let's just kind of think about that and think about the next state of consciousness will determine the next turning, basically. That's my own personal theory, and that's based on, not personal theory actually, but that's my own personal belief based on natural law.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Now that's interesting. So as you just mentioned, the people are going to have the hardest time in this fourth turning right now, who are still really in the dark age of materialism, as I would call it, right? Really just having a materialistic view, because you can only be afraid of death, be afraid of the future and everything just crumbling materially or physically if you really just are stuck in materialism.
Yeah.
And that's also the obsession of the materialist transhumanists, right? Of just, they're really deep conscious or unconscious rather fear of death gets them into like trying to extend life at all costs, trying to stay young. And we see this pathology nowadays in this world, even, of all the, we talked about this before, cosmic surgeries and all of that, trying to, idealize youth and all of that, and is trying to stay young, extend life. There's death or fear of death driving all of this because of this materialistic view or addiction, so to speak. But as you share this, it's really fascinating because all of it points to a deep paradox, because what's happening in the world right now, I've mentioned this before, you can see it from many, many different levels. And I would also argue right now with this fourth turning, it's even more intense than the other turnings before because of the Pluto return of the US. Number one, and what's happening collectively in light of the time of transition, and a bigger shift that's happening that hasn't happened maybe in previous turnings. So it has the same blueprint, but there's something even bigger occurring, I would say, on that level, which probably also ties into Pluto and Aquarius. But what I want to try to hint at, or what I want like to address is, we can see it right now, what's happening in the US. People blame Biden, right? Let's go Brandon and all of that. Right. Although we all know he's just a puppet for the deep state and all of that. He's not really in charge and whatnot, but still the blame, and Trump maybe was in the way of it. But when we look at these cycles, what's happening is also inevitable from a much higher perspective.
Yeah.
All empires have their time, of rise and destruction. Look at Rome, look at Atlantis, look at the Persian Empire and all of that.
Yeah.
And we see this now happening within the US, and it's mirrored in these archetypal cycles, be it these fourth turnings, be it this in the cycles of the ages, as shown through various esoteric traditions, the yugas, for example, and all that. It goes also in light of evolutionary astrology, on the Pluto generations and all these cycles, but everything goes over cycles, or what you said, also the natural law, even the Hermetic principles, right? The principle of rhythm, of polarity, everything is swinging to one side, then over to the other side. And it goes in a spiral more up and down. But the key point is also, or look at from the law of ascent and descent. We have to disintegrate in order to rise again and build something new.
Yes.
But like you mentioned, there's also a big opportunity right now. That's what people forget. What you addressed there as well. And I was watching. I forgot what it was. YouTube with the guy from Valuetainment, Patrick Bet, David,
yeah,
something like that. I like him. I like his attitude. He's a very wealthy businessman, but he talked about these times as well, and these opportunities, and he made an interesting correlation. He showed about all the recessions over the past years that happened, especially around 2008. In those recessions, actually, very successful businesses were built, right?
They were started.
That's when exactly they were started. Like was Airbnb, Uber,
yes,
and other startup companies. They were created in the midst of a recession.
Yes, and that actually links in with this Dane Rudyard quote where he talks about that you have to plant the seeds of the new world in before the destruction happens, basically.
Yeah.
Because when it's almost like if you don't plant anything in winter, you don't have anything for spring.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what we need to focus on.
Precisely. That's why, again, like I said at the beginning of this podcast, it's understandable. It's all there's fear out there, there's panic, worry about the future, financially, economically. It's almost like a trauma response, but people then also get into the freeze state. And without seeing like, actually, hold on, there's an opportunity. Yes, take care of yourself and be practical and realistic on many levels, but still be a visionary. See the opportunity. The irony right now, everybody's so scared to spend money right now, but at the same time, we're in a hyperinflation like we've never been before. So just sitting on your fiat money is also just going to lose the value of it is going to lose tremendously over the next years. So there's investment opportunities. Most importantly, I see also investing into myself and all of that to kind of like create the foundation. But this is ripe to plant the seeds for the new world right now on many different ways, because we cannot go back to the old ways. Like you mentioned before, we need to build something new. So it's also up to us as individuals to use our God-given creativity, right? Our will, our determination to be anti-fragile in these times and create the seeds for the new world.
Yeah, you need to prepare during basically the fourth turning, because the first turning will be followed by a high. So it's almost like I see the fourth turning. We're putting the seeds. It's dark. It's fertile. It's fertile for the seeds to, like the darkness and the density almost like gives us the material we need to plant the new seeds, if that makes sense. So, he's very interesting in this book because he really talks about the generational archetypes, and he says they always come in the same order: prophets, nomads, hero, and artists, and they all have characteristics. And so he talked about the hero generation, which is the GI generation that was 1901 to 1924, the artists, the silent generation, 1925 to 1942, the prophets, which is the baby boom generation, 1943 to 1960. Then we have the nomads, which is Gen X, 1961 to 1981. And the next heroes will be the millennial generation, 1982 to 2004, and so on and so forth. So it repeats itself, right? So I'm not going to go into his version of the archetypes, but I found an interesting correlation in evolutionary astrology and the generations of Pluto. So basically how this kind of links up is the hero generation is a Pluto and Cancer generation / Gemini generation. The artists are the Pluto and Cancer generation to the Pluto and Leo generation. The prophets are Pluto and Leo to Pluto and Virgo. Nomads are Pluto and Virgo to Pluto and Libra. The next heroes are Pluto and Libra, Pluto and Scorpio, and Pluto and Sag. And the next artists, Pluto and Sag, Capricorn, then on, right? So this is just kind of my correlation to it. So now I'm going to talk about how this links into evolutionary astrology and how this is personally relatable to you based on your Pluto sign. So before I get into it, I want to go over some basic principles of evolutionary astrology and why it is important to understand these in order to understand the concepts I'm about to go into. So evolutionary astrology is based on natural law and natural science, meaning it's observable in nature. You can correlate it in nature. You don't need to believe in it in order for it to be real. It's happening already. So it's really important to understand that astrology does not determine life. It reflects the life cycles of nature. So it's not determining things. It's reflecting something that's already in existence in natural law. So you can actually observe and correlate the truth of astrology in any natural process in nature, basically, in life itself.
It goes actually in line with the natural Hermetic principle, as above, so below, as within, so without.
Yes.
Right? I think the biggest misconception of people who don't know astrology or that have also bought into the many oversimplification distortions of astrology over the years, especially since it has become more quote-unquote mainstream and the New Age has distorted it, that, like you just said, it's not deterministic. The planets don't impel you to do anything. They're not external of you. They're more a reflection of deeper collective and personal psychic processes.
It shows potentialities, not actualities. I think that's the key thing. So natural law is basically guided by two main principles. We've touched on it. There's involution and evolution. So evolution and involution. Involution is about endings, destruction, dissolution, dissolving of current structures. We're both evolving and involving all the time. And then evolution is change. It means a transmutation of one form into another. And then there's two types of evolution. There's cataclysmic, which is like sudden, fast, and then there's slow and steady. And ultimately, the soul evolves from ego into soul and then back to source. And the whole point of Pluto in the chart is to eliminate all desires until only one desire is left, to return to the divine, to unite with the divine, basically. But the main thing is I think the spiritual misconception we have is that in order to unite with the divine, you just become an ascetic and you just pretend you don't have any desires. But the more tantric perspective, which we talked about on many different podcasts before, is that if you deny your desires, it actually prolongs them. It actually suppresses them into the unconscious and it creates a complex and it actually makes it stronger. So we want to actually look at the unconscious desires that the soul has came in here with, seen by Pluto, because they're clues to what the soul is looking to evolve in this lifetime. So Pluto in your chart represents your soul's core emotional and psychological concerns. And these core and emotional and psychological concerns have been going on for multiple lives. So your Pluto placement represents both, something that you gravitate towards, and also something you may be exploring for multiple lifetimes. And basically the opposite sign and house of your Pluto placement points it's called the polarity point, represents the archetype your soul is looking to evolve towards. So we are all generationally evolving consciousness in some way seen by the Pluto archetypes. And there is a specific reason why each Pluto generation is here right now during the fourth turning. Basically, we all have a certain role to play in evolving consciousness. And before I get into each archetype and what it means, I just want to preface this with that your Pluto, I'm just going into the overall Pluto generations, which are anywhere from 8 to 20 years. Your Pluto is also going to be in a house as well, which you could only really find out through actually doing your astrology chart. We do go into this way deeper in the course. I give everyone their Pluto placement, house, and sign, and I do astrology readings with people in the course. So I'm not open for public readings, but I do in the program. If you want, you could always just Google evolutionary astrologers and try and find someone who resonates with you. But just so you know, I just want to preface this that I'm giving a general reading based on the generations, and there are going to be particularities to you and your chart as demonstrated by house and aspect.
Yeah. I want to just note on that as well, because in our program, Time of Decision and Body Soul Awakening, which is really a lot of material, we have a whole section on evolutionary astrology that goes even deeper on what Laura just talked about, for everybody to get a basic understanding. Because I want to just point that out, evolutionary astrology has helped me tremendously over the past few years as well. And it gives you a better, quote unquote, almost objective understanding, not only of yourself. It's not personality. A lot of astrology focuses on personality, but your deeper soul lessons and soul purpose, even karmic lessons, past lives, and all of that. And the way we structure in our course, as Laura said, gives certain insights to everybody's chart based on all these placements and aspects, but really giving also more practical advice and practices, bringing in the psychological somatic work, the spiritual work, the esoteric work practices, embodiment practices, and all of that helps you to work with that on a more practical level. And it's not just intellectual knowledge.
Exactly. So we're going to start by talking about the Pluto generations alive today. And for the sake of time, I'm going to start with the Pluto and Leo generation. And I'm not going to, even though there's some Pluto and Cancer people alive today, the youngest of them are 83. So I'm sorry if you're a Pluto and Cancer person, but I'm going to start with Pluto and Leo for the sake of time on this podcast. So this is basically anyone born between 1937 to 1957. If you're born like within that year, you want to Google it and check out the exact dates and find out. But from 1937 to 1957, this archetype includes you. So these people come of age during a high period, basically. And the sole desire for this generation was creative actualization of the self. And I think a kind of good person to think of in this generation was Steve Jobs. Is like tremendous creative energy. He linked it with something that was socially useful, a bit narcissistic, definitely from rumors about him, had a total like God complex, was a bit like a king, that's also a Pluto and Leo thing. But the bottom line for this generation is to explore this idea of creative self-actualization. So they're just here to kind of shine their creative gifts and show it to the world, So this is actually the kind of hippie generation as well. Were born and come of age during this period. So the hippie generation came of age during the high period. So that's what we want to understand. So Pluto and Leo were born between 1937 and 1957, and they came of age, meaning their prime age during the high period. So a lot of these people have influenced culture that we're seeing now. So the hippie movement, Steve Jobs, and there's really just this needing attention and acknowledgement with this placement. This placement is also known for like narcissism and narcissistic wounding even. So you see actually the hippie generation, they were very focused on self-actualization, and a lot of them actually ended up being almost like too self-focused, too narcissistically focused.
It's just fascinating to see it in that light, actually. What is the saying tune in, drop out.
Yes, yeah.
Timothy Leary, and just make love, not war, and
Exactly.
just like don't care about. That was actually a guy also got hijacked by the CIA counterintelligence program to destroy the anti-war movement, because they're just like, oh, who cares about anything? Let's just indulge in ourselves, right?
Exactly, which was a core soul intention of that placement. But the shadow side is obviously of that narcissism, having this kind of king or queen complex, which can be overt or covert. That's why I said Steve Jobs is a good example, because he strongly had this creative vision, and then it got like too inflated, too high, So the main lesson for this is you must forget that all your creative energy doesn't belong to you. It's not part of you. You are maybe a channel of it, but it's not part of you, basically.
Yes.
Exactly. And the lesson for this placement is actually in the previous archetype, in the Cancer archetype, is if you haven't sorted out your childhood stuff and learn how to be really kind of solid in a sense of self-esteem, then you're going to be constantly demanding reassurance and validation, basically. And that's where the narcissism comes from. So to really understand that no amount of external validation for your external gifts will be enough if you haven't had that basis within yourself, that emotional basis seen by the Cancer archetype. So, to really also identify less with the creative role you have to play, so that your ego doesn't hijack it and you don't develop this kind of king or queen complex, And then if you have trouble expressing this creative energy that I'm describing and you're born in the Pluto generation, just look at the early childhood. How did that affect your self-esteem? How did that affect your sense of self? So again, we're looking at the previous developmental stage. So basically, if the creative energy is blocked with this placement, or if it's over-exaggerated, so if it's blocked, it will be almost like this strong negativity, and that light will be very dim, and there'll be kind of like issues expressing the negativity. If it's kind of over extreme, it will be narcissism. So you kind of want to connect to that inner light, but without identifying with it, basically. And the number one evolution for this placement is to link their special destiny with something that's relevant to humanity, So the placement can actually kind of be disappointed again and again, and feeling like they're not getting the acknowledgement they desire or they deserve, because they're not linking it to something that's socially useful. So it's important to kind of find a higher order of meaning beyond the subjective experience of your own creative self-actualization, and link your creative energy to something that's socially useful to humanity. So once you do that, you'll actually find that people appreciate you more. And that's why Steve Jobs is a good example, because Pluto and Leo did something socially useful, did something that helped humanity, and he linked his creative gifts with humanity. So I just want to note too that this archetype of the Pluto and Leo generation will also correlate if you have Pluto in aspect to your sun or Pluto in the 5th house. So that's only for the people who really kind of know astrology, so they can kind of apply that if you do have some aspects that are linked to the sun. So I'm going to go into one more generation, the Pluto and Virgo generation, and then we're going to do Pluto in Libra and Pluto in Scorpio, and then Pluto in Sag in the second hour. So for those who don't know, we offer a second hour for our podcast. I think it's about $11 a month, right? And you can listen to basically the whole second hour of our podcast, where often we go deeper and we go much more in depth about things we can't even say on the podcast. So if you want to sign up for the second hour of the podcast, go to veilofreality.com and you'll see it under the membership section. So Pluto and Virgo, 1956 to 1972. These people come of age during an awakening period. So this can also relate to if you have Pluto in the 6th house or Pluto and Mercury in aspect to Mercury, if you know your astrology chart. So the sole desire for this is to really humble yourself. It's about developing true humility through self-analysis, basically, in one word, or one sentence rather. So it's finding about like, how can I be useful to society? How can I offer something function to the collective? And you do this actually through purifying your own inner nature, through self-analysis and through looking at yourself and analyzing and improving yourself. And through this, you develop true humility, basically. But then the shadow side of this placement is people tend to use this ability to analyze, to break things apart against themselves. And this leads to being self-critical, a really strong inner critic, a pattern of negative thinking where you're just taking all the negative messages people have told you and like replaying in your brain until you beat yourself up, basically. So the point of the self-analysis with this placement is basically to gain a more objective sense of yourself and just improve your consciousness. So the problem if the inner critic takes over too much or the Pluto and Virgo generation is it gets to the point where it can be paralyzing, or it can just be this nonstop program. I'm never good enough. I'm not ready. There can be this problem of like emerging into the life that you're meant here to lead with this placement, you know? Or there can just be staying busy to keep this anxiety at bay, you know, which can, or even workaholism, which can result in like health problems or exhaustion. This is also a crisis signature. So sometimes with this placement, these people, this generation need to be pushed to a crisis before they really realize that something needs to be taken care of. A lot of these people with this placement come from past lives of Judeo-Christian backgrounds or very strict religious conditioning, which create this sense of like original sin, like I'm flawed, I'm defective, you know, so something fundamentally wrong with me, I'm unworthy, basically. And this is coming from this almost distorted desire for purification, basically. And there can be this almost like strong inner critic because you could never be pure enough. You could never be good enough, basically. And the real, like the healthy side of it is self-observation, self-improvement, humility, striving for perfection, but realizing that you're human and you're probably never going to be as perfect as the divine is, unfortunately. And it's about developing natural humility, basically. And natural humility, not false humility, where you're like putting yourself down, when you're not overly pumping yourself up. So like somewhere in between being like, I'm human and I have gifts to offer the world. And there's something great about me. I may not be perfect, but I'm always learning and growing. And that's what matters, basically. So, you know, again, this is about developing through humility. And the reason it follows the Leo archetype is because the Leo archetype kind of comes out in all its glory. Like, look at me, I have all these creative gifts to offer. And then the Virgo archetype kind of cuts it down a notch. And it's like, okay, you're both human and divine. Yeah, you have moments of amazingness, but you have moments of total terribleness too, you know? And to find almost a perfection in your imperfection and be a true servant or service to be a true service to others from a grounded place in a real practical way. And then the polarity point, meaning the ultimate evolution for this Pluto generation, is basically this 12th house Pisces archetype and looking at like compassion, universal principles like forgiveness. It's really important for people to learn with the Pluto and Virgo generation to learn how to apply forgiveness, acceptance, compassion, to realize that creation is perfect, whether it's disintegrating or in full bloom, to kind of see this holistic view of the universe, you know, and really forgive themselves for everything that they ever thought was wrong with them, and just kind of working with that and realizing that there's nothing wrong with you, you know, that the forgiveness you need to give yourself will release the shame that can kind of accompany the Pluto and Virgo generation, and just kind of understanding higher qualities. So, you know, universal qualities like faith, surrender, trust in the divine, you know. And for people with this placement, they often found religion early on through this almost like persecutory dynamic, like original sin, you're born a sinner, you know, but rather you need to find spirituality through understanding the more holistic awareness of the whole. So you really zoom out with this polarity point. So it is really about cultivating a relationship with the divine, a real relationship to the divine, not from this place that like, I'm not good enough, I'll never be good enough, but like the relationship with the divine, meaning you can zoom out and see the universal forces, see the bigger picture, see that how creation operates through these larger universal principles. And then you learn to kind of flow with the natural currents of life rather than overanalyzing them to the point where you get stuck, basically. So, you know, this will also generate real humility when you realize that creation is already perfect. So we're going to go into the next two Pluto generations, which is Pluto and Libra, Pluto and Scorpio in the second hour. But I just want people to reflect on that, you know, and also I want to let people know that these themes may be relevant to you regardless of whether or not you're in the Pluto generation, because you may have these archetypes very strongly in your chart as well. So I just want to point that out as an extra kind of aside.
Yeah, that's an important point for people who are not, not know much about astrology, or like you mentioned, this is definitely generational. However, like you just said, Pluto and Leo, that generation that comes out of age right now. But also if you have, like you said, in your chart, but you only know if you know your personal birth chart, your natal chart, if you have Pluto in the 5th house. So you have aspects of Pluto in Leo, right?
Or Pluto in aspect to Sun.
Or Pluto aspect to Sun.
Which you and I both have.
Because that's true. Because Sun is the ruler of Leo.
Exactly.
So that's how you interpret it.
Yes, yes.
And also what you just mentioned, Pluto in Virgo generation, or if you have Pluto in the 6th house or aspects to Mercury, right?
Yes,
Mercury
exactly.
is the ruler of Virgo.
Or even if you have strong Virgo archetypes elsewhere in your chart as well, that's definitely relevant to you.
So these are just archetypes.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Beautiful.
So, in the second hour, we're going to talk a little bit about the Pluto in Libra, Pluto in Scorpio generation. And then one thing I'm going to start touching on actually is where I see this going with Pluto in Aquarius as well. So,
that's the next.
Yeah, because we're going to enter Pluto in Aquarius in 2023. I actually see it. I mean, just notice the kind of themes in the headlines to kind of tell what's happening collectively. Yeah. And you see this actually, this AI, this guy who worked for Google, and his AI, which he said became sentient, got like all exposed on Twitter, and then he got fired and whatnot. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that this is going to be part of the Pluto and Aquarius generation.
I mean, we can even the whole market, cryptocurrency is down. Everybody thinks it's done over. No. Cryptocurrency, Bitcoin is a huge Aquarius archetype topic, which is going to just definitely take off, in the Aquarius generation when Pluto enters into Aquarius. And it's interesting also, we can be in touch. We talked about him before, Vitalik, one of the co-founders for Ethereum. He's Aquarius, and we looked at his chart. He has like a stellium with 5 or 4 planets in Aquarius. So once Pluto goes through, it's going to affect him intensely. So, astrology and cryptocurrency, there's something to be said that as well, right?
Yes.
But that's on the side note. Yeah, let's go deeper into all the other archetypes. It's extremely insightful, helped me a lot. And as Laura just mentioned before, we go into evolutionary astrology in context of many other topics and more practical embodied practices in our 12-week group coaching program, Time of Transition Embodied Soul Awakening. The next round starts July 25th. And we're open for applications, limited space. Go to thetimeoftransition.com or go to my website, veilofreality.com under courses. And again, the second hour is available for members. If you're not a member yet, you can also sign up at veilofreality.com. And also want to share again, besides the astrology aspect of the Pluto generations, going the second half of this podcast, I also want to talk more about at times when, even the quote unquote positive side of worry, the motivation for action, using the will, discipline, and all of that. And we also see a theme coming up. A lot of people are dealing with loneliness and the disillusionment and getting out of the consensus state and the individuation process, which results in maximum alienation and loneliness, and is part of the path. I recently even wrote an article about that, the most important realization on the path towards awakening. It's a new article I wrote. You guys can check it out on my website, veilofreality.com as well. And so we touch upon these topics as well in the second hour. With that being said, see you on the other side.